The rain on 125th Street didn't wash anything away that night. It just made the blood run faster. It was 3 minutes past 2 in the morning, and the silence in Harlem was heavy enough to crush a man's chest. This wasn't the quiet of sleep. It was the quiet of a jungle holding its breath before the tiger strikes. On the corner of Lenox Avenue, inside a dimly lit storefront that officially sold cigars but actually sold hope in the form of policy slips, 3 men stood in the dark. They were holding Thompson submachine guns. They weren't breathing. They were listening. Outside, the tires of a black sedan crunched over broken glass, then another, then a third. The enemy wasn't just at the gates, they were inside the walls. The syndicate had finally decided that the Harlem problem had a solution, and that solution was a massacre. They had the numbers, they had the political connections downtown, they had the police commissioner in their pocket and the judges on their payroll. By all metrics of war, the battle was over before the first shot was fired. The Italians were going to take the numbers racket, and they were going to burn anyone who stood in the way. But inside that storefront, the man sitting in the back chair wasn't holding a gun. He was holding a glass of lukewarm water. He wasn't looking at the door. He was looking at a rotary telephone sitting on a wooden crate. He didn't look afraid. He looked bored. One of his lieutenants, a man named Junie, was sweating through his suit. He whispered that there were 20 men outside. He whispered that they were trapped. He whispered that this was the end. The man in the chair just took a sip of water. He checked his watch. He adjusted his cufflink. "They aren't here to kill us, Junie," he said, his voice barely a rumble in his throat. "They're here to see if I flinch." The door handle turned. The latch rattled. The wood groaned under the pressure of a shoulder pressing against it from the outside. The men with the Thompsons raised the barrels. The safety catches clicked off, a sound like a cracking bone in the silence. The man in the chair didn't move. He just stared at the phone. He was waiting. Not for the police, not for backup. He was waiting for the exact second when the power dynamic would shift, not by lead, but by leverage. He knew something the men outside didn't. He knew that violence is loud, but real power is a whisper. The phone rang. Once. Twice. The door burst open. If you're drawn to the untold power stories of Harlem and the men who ruled without noise, you're already in the right place. This is Bumpy Johnson Files. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. The history books will tell you about the gang wars of the 1930s. They will tell you about Dutch Schultz and his manic violence. They will tell you about Lucky Luciano and the corporate restructuring of the American Mafia, but they won't tell you about this phone call. You won't find it in the NYPD archives. You won't find it in the FBI surveillance logs from the era. It was scrubbed, erased, buried under layers of payoffs and fear. But the streets remember. The old-timers who sat on the stoops in the decades that followed, they knew. They knew that the fate of Harlem wasn't decided in a courtroom or a shootout. It was decided in a moment of absolute terrifying stillness by a man who understood that if you want to kill a beast, you don't shoot it in the hide, you stop its heart. This story changes everything you think you know about how the underworld worked. It wasn't about who had the most guns. It was about who had the discipline to keep them holstered until the rest of the world blinked. To understand the call, you have to understand the man who answered it, But before he was a legend, before he was the Godfather of Harlem, he was just a man carrying a weight that would have broken anyone else. Imagine the pressure. You were living in a segregated America where the law is a weapon used against you, not for you. You are intelligent, brilliant actually. You read Nietzsche and history. You understand philosophy and chess, but the world sees only a criminal. Every day is a test of survival. You walk down the street and people look to you for protection. The widow who can't pay her rent, the boy who got arrested for being in the wrong neighborhood. They don't call the police, they call you. You become a vessel for their hopes and their fears, and that creates a loneliness that cuts deeper than any knife. You can't show fear, you can't show doubt. If you crack even for a second, the whole neighborhood crumbles. He carried this. He walked with a slight limp, not from injury, but from the burden of being the only wall standing between his people and total exploitation. He sat in diners, eating alone, watching the door, calculating angles, memorizing license plates. He slept with one eye open for 20 years. This wasn't about greed. It was about sovereignty. It was the desperate, clawing need to own something in a country that said you could own nothing. And the Italians, they smelled that desperation. They mistook it for weakness. They saw the poetry books and the quiet demeanor, and they thought he was soft. They didn't see the rage. They didn't see the cold, hard calculus of a man who had already accepted his own death and was now just negotiating the price of everyone else's. They started moving in slowly at first. It was 1935. The numbers racket, the policy game, was the banking system of Harlem. It was the only economy that mattered. It was pennies and nickels, but gathered together, it was millions. It was the lifeblood. Dutch Schultz, the Dutchman, the beer baron of the Bronx, looked at Harlem and saw a gold mine unguarded. He didn't care about the culture. He didn't care about the people. He just saw numbers. He sent his men in with bats. They beat the runners. They smashed the storefronts. They didn't ask for a percentage. They demanded the whole pot. Most of the Harlem bosses folded. They were businessmen, not soldiers. They saw the machine guns and the political connections of the mob, and they handed over the keys. They chose survival. But there was one shadow that didn't move. At first, he was just a rumor. The mob enforcers would go to a spot on 7th Avenue and they'd find their own men unconscious in the alley, stripped of their weapons, with a single chess piece left in their pocket. A pawn. It was a message. You are playing a game you do not understand. The Italians were confused. They were used to fear. They were used to people screaming. They weren't used to silence. They sent more men, harder men, hitmen from Murder, Inc., killers who'd turned murder into an industrial process. They went looking for the man they called the Professor. They found empty apartments. They found cryptic notes. They found that every time they tried to close a fist around Harlem, smoke slipped through their fingers. He was watching them. He knew their schedules. He knew which cops they paid. He knew which judges they owned. He knew about the mistresses and the gambling debts. He was gathering files, not just distinct crimes, but the architecture of their power. Tension began to bleed into the streets. It wasn't just a gang war anymore. It was a siege. The residents of Harlem walked quickly, heads down. The jazz clubs were empty. The air smelled of impending doom. Dutch Schultz was losing patience. He was a man of violence, not strategy. He screamed at his capos. He demanded a head on a stick. He put a bounty on the head of the man who refused to kneel. $50,000, dead or alive. In 1935, that was a fortune. It was enough to make a brother turn on a brother. The walls were closing in. This is where everything changed. This is where the man became the king. He didn't run. He didn't hide in a basement. He put on his best suit. He shaved. He walked right down the middle of 125th Street in broad daylight. He walked into the barber shops. He walked into the diners. He shook hands. He kissed babies. It was a display of such supreme arrogance that it froze the hitmen in place. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. Was he crazy? Was he suicidal? No, he was demonstrating control. He was telling Harlem, I am not afraid, and if I am not afraid, you don't have to be either. But behind the smile, the mind was working at 1,000 miles an hour. He knew he couldn't win a shooting war. The Italians had an army. He had a platoon. If it went to the mattresses, Harlem would burn to the ground. He needed a checkmate. He needed to bypass the soldiers and go straight to the emperor. Schultz was the problem, but Schultz wasn't the top of the food chain. Above the Dutchman sat the commission. Above the chaos sat Charles Lucky Luciano. Luciano was a businessman. He didn't like bodies in the street. It was bad for business. It brought heat. It brought prosecutors. The man in Harlem knew this. He had studied Luciano just as he had studied the philosophers. He knew that Luciano valued order above all else. So he crafted a plan so dangerous that one mistake would mean not just his death, but the torture and execution of everyone he loved. He began to kidnap the bagmen, not the runners, the bagmen, the guys carrying the mob's money from downtown back to the Bronx. But he didn't steal the money. This is the part that history tried to bury because it doesn't make sense to a common criminal. He took the money, he counted it, and he sent it back. He would kidnap a bagman carrying $10,000. He would hold him for an hour, he would give him a sandwich, and then he would send him back to Dutch Schultz with every single dollar accounted for, and a note. I can take it whenever I want. I'm choosing not to. It was psychological warfare of the highest order. He was telling them, I don't need your money. I own your logistics. Schultz went insane with rage. He ordered a scorched earth policy. He wanted to bomb the policy banks. He wanted to shoot up the clubs. The night of the phone call was the apex of this madness. Schultz had sent his heavy hitters to Lenox Avenue. They weren't there to negotiate. They were there to execute the leadership of the Harlem resistance. The three men in the storefront, the rain, the waiting. We are back in that room now. The door has just burst open. But the men with the Thompsons inside didn't fire. Because the phone rang. The lead hitman, a giant of a man with a scar running down his cheek, froze. His foot was across the threshold, his gun was raised, but the sound of that ring cut through the tension like a razor. The man in the chair picked it up. He didn't say hello, he didn't ask who it was. He simply said, put him on. He listened for 10 seconds. His face was a mask of stone. The hitmen stood there confused. This wasn't in the script. They were supposed to kick the door and start shooting. Why were they waiting? Because the man in the chair held up one finger. Just one finger. A command. Wait. And in that storefront, 20 armed killers waited on the finger of an unarmed man. He spoke into the receiver. His voice was low, devoid of anger. Tell the Dutchman that his route to New Jersey is compromised. Tell him I have the ledger for the union payments on the docks. Tell him that if one bullet is fired in Harlem tonight, those ledgers go to Dewey in the morning." Silence. Dewey was the special prosecutor. He was the one man the mob feared. The man in the chair continued, "And tell Lucky I don't want a war. I want a partnership, but I determine the rates, and I determine who walks on my sidewalk." He hung up. He didn't look at the hitmen. He poured another glass of water. The lead hitman stared at him. The seconds ticked by. The rain hammered against the glass. Then the phone rang again. The hitman looked at the phone, then at the man. "That's for you," the man in the chair said. The hitman walked over. He lowered his gun. He picked up the receiver. He listened. His face went pale. He nodded. "Yes, boss. Yes. Understood." He hung up the phone gently, as if it were made of glass. He looked at the man in the chair with a new expression. It wasn't fear anymore. It was awe. "Let's go," the hitman said to his crew. "What?" one of them asked. "I said, let's go. We're done here." They backed out of the storefront. They got back into the black sedans. The engines roared to life, and the convoy turned around, heading back downtown, back to the border, back to a world where they thought they were kings. The man in the chair sat alone in the dark. He had just bluffed the most powerful criminal organization in American history. He didn't have the ledgers. He didn't have the union books. It was a lie, a magnificent, terrifying lie, constructed on the profile he had built of being the man who knew everything. He banked his life on the fact that they would believe he was smarter than them, and he was right. That night, the rules changed. Word spread through Harlem like wildfire. They came, they saw him, they left. The legend grew instantly. It wasn't Bumpy Johnson the gangster anymore. It was Bumpy Johnson, the protector. The deal that followed was unprecedented. The syndicate recognized his control. They agreed to work with him, not over him. They split the profits, but he kept the territory. No other black gangster in America had achieved that level of autonomy. He had forced the syndicate to treat Harlem as a sovereign nation. But as the years went on, the weight of that night never left him. He knew that a bluff only works once. He had to spend the rest of his life making sure he actually did know everything. He had to become the man he pretended to be that night. He built a network of spies. He befriended judges. He played chess in front of the station house. He ruled for decades. He went to Alcatraz and came back. He watched the world change. He watched the heroin epidemic that he helped facilitate tear apart the very community he saved from the Italians. That is the tragedy of the king. To save the kingdom, he had to poison the well. But on that rainy night in 1935, none of that mattered yet. There was only the silence after the cars drove away. He stood up from the chair. His legs were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline leaving his body. He walked to the door and looked out at the wet pavement. He lit a cigar. The flame illuminated his face for a brief second. He looked tired. He had won, but he knew the cost. He knew that once you pick up that phone, you can never really hang it up. You are always on the line. The man who saved Harlem didn't do it with a gun. He did it by understanding the nature of power. Power isn't force. Power is perception. It's the ability to make your enemy believe that destroying you will cost them more than letting you live. It's the patience to sit in a dark room, unarmed, and wait for the phone to ring. And it's the wisdom to know that when history is written, the pen is held by the one who survives. This is Bumpy Johnson Files. Subscribe for the stories history tried to bury.